Morning, everybody. Some of my information is going to duplicate what the previous presenter spoke about, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on those slides. I will try to cover them from the perspective of the police and issues we may deal with respect to those slides that are duplicates. So first off, just as a general overview, elder abuse. Lovely topic, I know. It's a situation that unfortunately we, the police, are dealing with on an increasing basis. But having said that, I believe that it's far underreported. Not only do I believe that, I know that. It isn't getting reported. So the statistics that we have and that the general public have and that you see in the media are actually much higher than they are presented. Okay, they're going to the right door. So what is elder abuse? Any action or inaction by any person that causes harm or threatens to cause harm to an older person. So that can cover a lot of things. There is no universal definition as to what an older person is or what a senior is. So what's considered an elder abuse versus straight abuse. Some police forces use 55, some 60, some 65. As I said, there really is no consistency or universal number that everybody uses, and it really depends on a variety of different factors. For example, somebody who's 65 could be completely capable, competent, able-bodied, able to take care of themselves. So although they are considered a senior by most people's definitions, they themselves might not consider themselves a senior. Contrarily, somebody who's 55 may be experiencing early onset dementia or Alzheimer's. They may fall under the definition of a senior. So really it's going to depend on a number of things. So today we're going to be talking about abuse by the attorney in the power of attorney situations. Can be, and a lot of the times it is, unfortunately, by a family member, a close friend, or somebody who has aligned themselves closely with the senior, with the elder person, purposely to get access to the senior, generally to their finances or to their property, in order that they can exploit that senior. Sad state of affairs, I know. So there are generally 4 types of abuse: financial, physical, psychological, and neglect. When we're talking about abuse by attorney, generally it seems to be financial. However, doesn't mean that the other types of abuse don't or can't happen, and unfortunately they do, but it is primarily financial. Statistics show that 4 to 6% of seniors aged 65 and over have experienced some form of abuse. But as I said earlier, that number in reality is much higher. It's just the underreporting of the abuse. And I'll talk a little bit later as to why that number is so low and why it's not reported. So just to go over briefly these 4 types of abuse, financial abuse is defined as the theft or exploitation of a person's money, property, or assets. So this can be theft of from their bank account, of their property, can be fraud, perhaps signing checks that they shouldn't be signing, could be forgery, that sort of thing. Physical can be it's any act of violence causing injury or physical discomfort, and that can be an assault, and that could be something as minor as a shove, a push, or it can be a blatant punch, a kick, pushing down the stairs, that sort of thing. Can be unlawful confinement, holding a person in a room or in their house and not letting them get out, or over and under medication. Quite often we see this happening, particularly if the senior has got behavioral issues or the person simply doesn't want to deal with the senior. They will over-medicate them. Or conversely, they'll be using their medication themselves and not giving it to the senior. And then there's psychological abuse. And this is defined as any action or comment that may cause emotional anguish or fear or diminish the self-esteem or dignity of the older person. Some people say that psychological abuse, the scars of that last far longer than any other form of abuse. And you can well imagine the impact that psychological abuse would have on anybody. And the final one is neglect. And there are really three kinds of neglect. It's intentional neglect, unintentional neglect, and self-neglect. Intentional neglect, much as the name implies, is when the neglect is on purpose. I'm purposely not giving you a bath, feeding you, caring for you, that sort of thing. Unintentional neglect, we see this quite often in situations where caregivers are caring for their own families, their children, their husband, their wife, as well as their parents. And they get burnt out and they simply can't do it any longer. They don't have the education. They're not really sure what's required. So it's not on purpose, just that they simply aren't capable or don't know any better. And then there's the self-neglect, where the person simply chooses not to care for themselves, not to eat properly, not to have proper hygiene, or to hoard. We've all seen situations, I'm sure, either on TV or in our personal lives of hoarders. Unfortunately, I think my mother is one of them. Thankfully, my mother has all her wits about her. She's 77 years old, very active, but she likes to keep things. She lives on her own. After my father passed away a few years ago, thankfully she was able to maintain the house. We were over at her place a little while ago, and I was downstairs in her laundry room, and I look up, and there's one of those old hair dryers, you know, those cone things. You take the lid off, and then it's got the thing like this, much like the old, in your old hairdressing, where then you sit your head underneath it and it dries your hair. She didn't even know she had it anymore. So I said, let's just get rid of it. Trying to help her purge some of the things that my brother and I won't have to do years from now when and if she does decide to leave the house. Oh no, we'll put that on Kijiji. We can get lots of money for that. That's an antique. Has she put it on Kijiji yet? No. I threaten, she goes to Florida every year, and I threaten her that we're going to go in and just clean out the house. Truthfully, I don't think she'd even notice she's got so much stuff. In any event, so that would be could be a form of self-neglect. So now on to powers of attorney. So as I said earlier, Elaine has covered a lot of this, so I'm not going to go into this in a whole lot of detail. Just a couple of key points. Unlike in the States, where attorney means a lawyer, that doesn't mean that here. Attorney is the person who acts on your behalf. And unless you limit your attorney's authority, they can do almost anything with your property that you can. But they cannot make or change your will or give a new power of attorney on your behalf. Okay, so a couple things to keep in mind there. So this is where police often get involved, is when the attorney starts to do things with your money or your assets against your will. So they start using their money for their own personal gain. Maybe they have got financial issues themselves, or they're caring for their own children as well as their parents. They're feeling really taxed. So they start maybe selling some of your property or worse. So that's the way, unfortunately, police become involved in these kind of situations. So as Elaine pointed out earlier, it's really important that you give consideration, careful and long consideration, as to who you appoint your attorney, because obviously it can go bad. Is the person trustworthy? Are they honest? Are they good at handling money? If you have children or any other relative who you are considering as appointing your attorney, and they're in debt, they've written bad checks before, the collectors are after them, you might not want to appoint them your attorney, because they at some point are going to be responsible for your assets, and you don't want them mismanaging your assets. And as Elaine said, are they willing? Because if they aren't willing, you could set yourself up for disaster, because it could put them in a position where they really don't want to do it. Therefore, they may not really care what happens to your money. So give careful consideration before you do appoint somebody your attorney. So why are the police interested in powers of attorney? Sadly, because abuse by power of attorney is growing. And as I said earlier, in reality, we don't know the half of it. We probably don't know a tenth of it that's really going on. Because most times, people appoint attorneys, generally it's their children or a spouse or somebody close to them. And secondly, it's often somebody upon whom they rely to care for them. So if they are to report this, either to the police or to somebody else, there's the risk that that person could be charged, or that that person will no longer act as their attorney, or will no longer care for them. So oftentimes, people don't want to report it because it could mean that there's nobody left to care for that person. So they would rather have the lesser of two evils, if you will, and continue to have their finances depleted or used inappropriately by their attorney than have nobody left to care for them. It's kind of a sad state. And we do find that some people will finagle their way into the lives of seniors, particularly those who are more vulnerable. For example, those ones who don't have any family members, either no family members close by or none at all. And they will target those seniors, become friends with that senior for the express purpose of gaining access to their money. Unfortunately, we've seen it happen to the point where seniors have lost everything. Their houses, their assets, and they've been left with nothing. Okay, Elaine talked about this section of the Criminal Code. Several years ago, the Criminal Code of Canada was amended and added this charge specifically because, unfortunately, they were finding that theft by power of attorney, theft by attorney, was growing. And it states, everyone commits theft who, being entrusted, either solely or jointly, and Elaine talked about that, jointly and severally, with another person, with a power of attorney for the sale, mortgage, pledge, or other disposition of real or personal property, fraudulently sells, mortgages, pledges, or otherwise disposes of the property or any part of it, or fraudulently converts the proceeds of a sale, mortgage, pledge, or other disposition of the property, or any part of the proceeds, to a purpose other than that for which he was entrusted by the power of attorney. Basically, in layperson's terms, what this means is they use the money or they sell the property for a purpose that suits themselves, for a purpose contrary to which the senior has set out. So steals from the bank account, sells their house. I've seen this happen where generally it's the children, unfortunately. They're perhaps struggling with financial issues themselves. And this tends to happen gradually. They will clean out the bank account, and then they realize, oh boy, mom doesn't have any money left. So they then put the house up for sale, sell the house right from under their mother's nose, and putting basically the mother on the street. And the mom's got nothing. Yes. Oftentimes they will use the Visa card. Visa bills then will keep coming in and they simply won't get paid. Or if there's enough money left in the account, they will pay off the Visa card, but it's all been for their own purpose. All the purchases have been for themselves. So all that would be considered theft by the power of attorney. How might you know if this is happening, or you suspect this is happening to a neighbor, a friend, a relative? How might you know? So there are some indicators that somebody is being abused financially. All of a sudden, there might be a change in their will or change in the power of attorney. And perhaps to somebody who you think maybe isn't appropriate, or as I indicated earlier, to somebody who all of a sudden came into the senior's life. A friend of my mother's in Aurelia who, after his wife passed away, sadly he deteriorated and is showing signs of dementia. He was in his own home, but gradually started to fail. This young person, whom he met at a local restaurant where he attended every day, and he's in his 70s, and this person was in her mid-40s, befriended him and agreed to give him rides places and help him with his groceries and help him with his finances and help him with his shopping, etc. I, being the fact that I'm a police officer, and tend to be suspicious because we tend to deal with, we don't tend to deal with the good things in life, unfortunately. I was quite suspicious, as was my mother, because we questioned, why is this woman all of a sudden, who didn't know this gentleman, wasn't friends with this gentleman prior, why is she all of a sudden wanting to have all this access and all this contact and doing all this help for my mom's friend? Was it altruistic? I don't know. But thankfully, the man's son was able to talk to him and have a conversation with him about this person and just made him think twice. So after that, my mom's friend, the senior, had a conversation with this woman, and lo and behold, she stopped her friendship with him, which in my opinion kind of confirmed my suspicions that she was there for one reason only. That's not to say that it can't happen where people are truly altruistic and do want to help. It does happen, but simply be cautious. So if you see something like that happening either to yourself or to somebody you know or a family member, just keep in the back of your mind. Have some questions. Be a little bit suspicious. Some other indicators. Sorry, I kind of got off track there. If there's unexplained bills, if the Visa card all of a sudden has all these purchases, and you know that if it's your parent, they don't go to the casino, they don't shop at La Senza, or, maybe they do, that's great. But if you have access to the Visa bill and you look over it and there's some purchases on there that are questionable, then you might want to look into things further. Inability to pay bills. All of a sudden, bills aren't getting paid, whereas before they were. You might want to consider that as well. Obviously, if personal belongings are starting to disappear, you might want to think that maybe that person is either keeping them for themselves or selling them and getting the money for them and keeping the money themselves. If all of a sudden there's large withdrawals from the bank account that weren't there before, another red flag. So again, I'm not going to really go into this because Elaine went into it fairly thoroughly. There are 3 types of power of attorney. Again, just be very cautious about who you choose to be your attorney. So when does a power of attorney become effective? Again, Elaine spoke about this. And one thing I will point out here is that making a power of attorney for personal care is also a way to make sure that your wishes about your personal care decisions are respected. For example, I don't want to, if I should get in a motor vehicle collision and I'm brain injured and I'm never going to be able to walk or move again, and they're keeping me alive on life support, no thanks, I don't want that. So that is going to be specifically in my power of attorney documents, that I don't want any life-saving heroic measures. So as long as that's in there, then my wishes will be respected. So it's important, if you have issues like that, to put that in there. So mental capacity, we talked about this briefly as well, but what is mental capacity? So it's defined as ability to not only understand, but also appreciate the foreseeable consequences of any action or inaction. So, to use my example, as I just said, if I were involved in a motor vehicle collision and wasn't going to be able to be off life support and brain injured, I can understand that situation, and I can appreciate the consequences if I'm taken off life support. So obviously I've got the mental capacity. If somebody doesn't appreciate the consequences, if they were taken off life support, then their mental capacity could be called into question. So a person can be capable of making some decisions and not others. For example, they may be capable of making decisions around their diet and hygiene. However, not about more complicated health care. So in those kind of situations, the attorney can make decisions only about the health care, not about my hygiene and diet. Okay? So we're going to talk about an actual case. This is a case actually from the Ottawa area. So we'll call him Mr. H. He's 87. He's lived with his stepson, who we'll call Mr. A, and Mr. A's common law wife, Mrs. B. In lieu of paying rent, Mr. H would assist with household expenses. So he lives with Mr. A and Miss B in their place, and he just helps with expenses, doesn't pay a rent. So in July of 2002, Mrs. B, she was angry with Mr. H, and she hit him several times and pushed him down a flight of stairs. You can imagine at the age of 87, the impact that could have. You know, bones tend to get brittle, etc., and we get physically hurt a lot easier the older we get. So police were called by the family. There was some extended family. Mr. H, thankfully, was of sound mind, and he was able to tell us what happened. And at the time, there were multiple bruises on his body, which were documented and noted by the police and by the family. He obviously was taken out of that situation and relocated someplace else, because we have to keep him safe. We also had him examined by a doctor who also documented all his injuries. The original statement of Mr. H, we use the term KGB. That's a technical way of saying he was interviewed, both video and audio recorded, and it was what we call under oath. So basically he promised to tell the truth. And at that time, although Mr. H did seem a little bit confused, he was cognizant enough to be able to tell us what happened. He understood fully well what happened to him. He knew his surroundings. He knew what was going on. So what happened next was Mrs. B, thankfully, was arrested for assault and assault causing bodily harm. Assault causing bodily harm is a charge that is somewhat more serious than assault because of the level of Mr. H's injuries. When we arrest somebody, we have the option of keeping them for bail, which means they would be held in jail overnight, and they have to explain to the judge why they think they should be released. So it would be up to the judge the next day to determine if that person should be released into the community or not. So that is what happened with Miss B. We held her for bail, and we opposed bail because we felt that she was a risk. Unfortunately, she was released sometime later. However, she did have a number of conditions placed upon her. And some of those conditions were, as you can well imagine, that she have no contact with Mr. H, because we needed to protect him, right? So we didn't want her having any contact with him, not only for his physical safety, but also we didn't want her trying to pressure him into changing his statement or not testifying against her. So she was released with what we call a surety. So she was released into somebody else's care, if you will, and that person promised to make sure that she abided by all her conditions. The surety eventually said, I've had enough of this. I don't want to be responsible for Miss B. And the surety revoked bail. And then there was an additional charge of obstructing police against Miss B. Because she was trying to convince Mr. H, she was having contact with him and trying to convince him not to follow through with the charge. Mr. A, the stepson, finally agreed to provide a statement as a witness, which is good for Mr. H and the police's side, right? So this was prepared in assistance with the Crown. And that was arranged actually through his lawyer. So prior to all this, Mr. H, so not quite a year prior, he actually appointed Miss B as his continuing power of attorney for property. And I'm sure you can all see where this is going. She then applied to the Department of Veterans Affairs, because he was a vet, on behalf of Mr. H, for disability and attendance benefits. Subsequently, the benefits were granted. They felt he was eligible to get the benefits, and they started mailing checks. Guess what? From November 1st to July 2002, so he received, I should say, 11 checks were mailed because he never received them. The total value of these checks was a little over $23,000. And to a person of 87 years of age who has a limited income, $23,000 is a lot of money. Particularly since now he's no longer living with Mr. A and Miss B. So once the Veterans Affairs agreed to the fact that Mr. H would be eligible for benefits, she opened an account at the Money Mart in order to be able to cash the checks. And the monies were used for both her and Mr. A's personal gain. So from September to July, so for almost a year, she made 40 unauthorized withdrawals from Mr. H's bank account, taking another $22,000 on top of the $23,000 from the Veterans Affairs checks. So she was arrested with an additional charge of theft by power of attorney. So she was first charged with the assault and the assault causing bodily harm, and then throughout the police investigation, this information came to light, and we found that she was not only abusing him physically, but also financially as well. And my guess would be, I don't know this, but my guess would be that there was probably some neglect and some psychological abuse as well. So there were some obstacles when police were investigating this situation. Obviously, Mr. H is 87 years old. There were some cognitive issues with him. He wasn't declared incompetent or incapable, but we did have to re-interview him because there were some issues that weren't clear. We also had to obtain his financial records, because how else could we prove that he wasn't getting this money, that there was all these transactions in his bank account that were unauthorized, and as well his medical records. And unfortunately, when we go to a bank and when we go to a doctor and we explain that we're doing investigation with respect to an assault and a possible financial abuse, they can't just say, oh, here you go, here's his medical file or here's his financial records. We have to do a lot of paperwork. We have to do search warrants in order to get that information. So it takes time. Then as well, there was the statement by Mr. A. I mean, thankfully he did give a statement, but it was under a little bit of pressure. And then we had to deal with the Department of Affairs. Again, there's the release of information. I'm sure you're all familiar with the release of information laws. Things are pretty strict, as they should be, because I don't want anybody releasing my information to anybody who walks up and asks them, right? But it did again require more time. So we couldn't just automatically, even though we strongly suspected what was happening with respect to the financial abuse, we couldn't just go arrest Miss B based on our suspicions. We had to have reasonable grounds. That's what, in police terms, means we had to believe beyond a reasonable doubt what was happening. So we had to get some evidence before we could lay that charge. And these investigations can be, and generally are, quite difficult and complicated because, as I indicated earlier, we're dealing with people who quite often have capacity issues. They may be confused. They may not be declared incapable or incompetent, but there's memory issues. You know, the older you get, you do tend to forget things. And the fact that these people were caring for him, providing him food, clothing, and shelter, albeit maybe not to the level that we would want for ourselves, but he was getting cared for. And I don't know what the alternative was for Mr. H. So there was likely some reluctance to report this. And I kind of liken it to situations of domestic violence, where generally women are reluctant to report the abuse because they rely upon their spouse for a number of things. And this is quite similar. Quite often we get asked, well, why do you even need a statement from the older person? You've seen the bruises, you've got the statement from Mr. A now. Why do you need to re-interview Mr. H, or why do you need to interview him in the first place? Well, it's really important for us to get that statement, and again on video and under oath, because quite often what happens is the person will take back their statement because they now realize, oh, I'm now stuck on my own. I have to move. I've got nobody else to care for me. I've got no money left, so I can't afford to stay in a long-term care home. What am I going to do? Gee, if I tell the court that what I said wasn't true, things go back to the way they were, albeit the person may continue to get abused, but they will have a roof over their head and they will get fed and clothed. Quite often as well, they may forget, particularly if the case is not heard in court right away, which generally is the case. If it goes to trial, it could be a year or more before the case goes to trial. Mr. H would have now been 88. His mental capacity may be a little bit more diminished, and he may forget some things. So that's why it's really important that we capture that on video. And as well as I indicated earlier, that these people are very vulnerable. They could be pressured into changing their statement. Or worse yet, they may pass away. If we have that statement on video, we can use that statement against the accused person, even if Mr. H would have died, and we can still get a conviction. And perhaps there comes a point where Mr. H may still be alive and still be present, but simply not able to provide a statement. Again, we could use that video kind of on his behalf. There was a question earlier about a language issue. Comes up quite often as well in our investigations. where we could be dealing with somebody of a different language than the officer speaks. There are certain rules and policies within the OPP, and this applies to all police forces actually, that we would not use a family member or somebody close to the senior person to provide a translation, because that person could be considered not objective. So we have access to a translation agency where they would provide translators for us in the event that this happens. Quite often, I work north of here where we don't have access to a whole lot of multicultural, multilingual officers. So I might call Toronto Police and see if they have somebody available, because they're a lot more multicultural than our force is, particularly an hour north of here. So really important for court reasons that we not use a family member or somebody close to the senior. So kind of touched on some of these already. When we would video interview the elderly witness, obviously if health is an issue, I would say like 100% of the time we would try. But the older they are, the more unhealthy they are, the seriousness of the offense. The more serious the offense, the more we're going to insist that the interview be videotaped. And the degree of cooperation. If Mr. H had not been cooperative, our suspicion would have been that he's not cooperative because he fears what may happen to him. Perhaps he's been threatened. Perhaps Miss B threatened him. If you say anything to the police, if you tell them what happened, things are going to get worse for you. I'm going to abuse you even more. Who's going to look after you, etc. So we have to keep that in mind as well. Particularly if the attorney is a relative or somebody close to the senior, as I said before. Quite often we will get uncooperative witnesses. And again, it's the same as in domestic violence. We gotta keep in the back of our minds why that person may not be cooperating. It's deep down, they probably want to tell the truth, but there's all these other factors going on that we have to consider. It does make our job that much more difficult. Because we want to help. We want to stop the abuse. We want to make sure that this doesn't happen anymore. And a lot of times, our only evidence is what the senior is going to tell us. So we rely quite heavily on that statement from the senior. So what can we do? Oftentimes, particularly if the abuse is by the hands of the caregiver, it may be something as simple as education. Maybe the caregiver doesn't know any better. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, and they didn't realize that they could spend that amount of money on their own personal effects, for their own personal use. Maybe they didn't realize they could use the Visa card, etc. And Elaine spoke earlier about the fees. Maybe they are going beyond those fees. Maybe they are taking more money than they are allowed. So it could be simply a matter of education. Or perhaps they're in that sandwich generation, and not only are they taking care of their parent, but they also are working full time, and they have children of their own that they have to take care of, and they're simply burnt out. And we all get stressed. We've all experienced stress, and I'm sure we've done things that are not appropriate that we regret. Maybe we've said some things. We've got angry at our parents or at our children, been a little too aggressive, that sort of thing. Not to excuse that behavior, but perhaps it's a matter of, again, educating that person, getting some supports in for that person, hooking them up with Community Care Access Center so that they could get some relief for themselves as well. We could work with the senior to develop some safety plans. I mean, if the senior is capable enough, we could educate them around how to keep themselves safe. We quite often get called to do what's called check on the well-being. We'll get called by neighbors, friends, or family members because they're concerned about their neighbor. Perhaps they haven't seen them, or the senior seems inappropriately depressed, or they've seen them out walking in the middle of the night inappropriately dressed. So we will get called to go check on the well-being of that senior. Happens all the time, and nothing wrong with doing that. And then we'll go in, speak with the senior, and check things out and find out what is going on. And then we will do an in-depth investigation, an in-depth assessment with the situation. And we will talk to neighbors, we'll talk to friends, we'll talk to family members, and get as much information as we can. And lastly, and I put this one here lastly on purpose, in the event there is a criminal offense, we can lay a charge under the appropriate legislation. If it's theft by power of attorney, we've talked about that one, or assault. Failing to provide the necessaries of life is a popular one as well. If somebody is not given the appropriate food, level of care, etc. And I put this last, as I said, for a reason, because generally this doesn't happen. Most times, people simply want the abuse to stop, be it physical, financial, or psychological. Because a lot of times it is at the hands of a family member or somebody close to them, and it's perpetrated by somebody upon whom the senior relies for their care. So they don't want the person to be charged because it'll mean that person being taken away. And there's nothing wrong with that. So again, what do? Bottom line is, our job is to protect the public and ensure the victim's safety. So we would investigate, obviously, if appropriate, we would charge and ensure that the victim has necessary referral information and support. So as I say, we would connect them with the appropriate resources. But when in doubt, if you don't know who to call us. Call Crime Stoppers if you want to remain anonymous. Crime Stoppers does not subscribe to Identicall, so your phone number, your name will not appear on the screen, and it will never come back to you. Because quite often people are concerned, well, if I call, they're going to know it's me, they're going to be mad at me. Well, you know what I say is, would you rather, if it's your friend or your family member, would you rather them be mad at you for calling? Or would you rather them be physically abused, be financially abused, etc.? So there are a number of different resources available. The first one I put up there is the Ontario Community Support Association. That is a community-based, not-for-profit organization that provides a wide variety of services to help people live in their own home. As we all know, people are living longer and they're staying in their own homes longer now. So this agency is a really good one. Community Care Access Center, I'm sure we're all familiar with that. They can help provide personal support workers for seniors in their home so that they are able to stay in their home, provide some relief for caregivers if they simply can't do it, if they need some assistance. The Office of the Public Guardian Trustee is available as well for information and to assist. It's really good, particularly where there is no power of attorney. Advocacy Center for the Elderly is a really good organization. They have a website. If you just Google Advocacy Center for the Elderly, that's all they do. Wealth of information there, not only on their website, but if you call as well. Really good information. I really like this quote. The prevention of abuse and neglect of older adults is a community challenge which will not be resolved quickly by one person or one approach. It will require a community effort to create an environment which reaffirms the rights of older adults to self-determination, respect, and dignity. And really that's what it comes down to, is it's a community. Much like it takes a community to raise a child, It takes a community to protect our seniors. So if you have a neighbor, a friend, a family member who you suspect is experiencing some sort of abuse, I believe it's incumbent upon you to do something about it, to talk to somebody, to talk to that senior. Because I'm sure if it were you, you would want somebody to speak up for you if you were unable to speak up for yourself. Another good resource is our internet webpage, www.opp.ca, and go to crime prevention section. There's quite a list of resources and tip sheets on elder abuse and seniors and keeping yourself safe. Pretty easy website to navigate. Thank you. I don't know how we're doing for time. If anybody has any questions, we have a few minutes. And there's a question at the back.
What happened to Mr. H and Miss B?
Oh, what happened to Mr. H and Miss B? Thankfully, Miss B was convicted, and Mr. B was able to live independently with some help away from Miss B, and he reconnected with Mr. A, his stepson, and it ended up positively. Yeah. Yes?
I just wonder whether you have come across any case scenarios in which the abuse was actually the reverse. Because I know that a lot of the seniors, because of the dementia or because of the medication, they can become quite aggressive. And I just wondered whether you had any cases where the caregiver actually call you to say that, the mother or the grandfather is actually threatening them.
Good question. So the question was, have I experienced any situations where it was reversed, where the senior is actually abusing the caregiver or the attorney? Yes, we have. And you're right, generally this does happen in the later stages of life when the senior starts to exhibit signs of dementia or Alzheimer's. And one of the behaviors is aggressiveness, and they can become assaultive. Quite often we find this in domestic situations where it's a husband and wife, and the husband is the one who is experiencing dementia, and he's now becoming aggressive with his wife. Happens quite frequently. A lot of times what we find is when we start digging that there was prior abuse, that it actually happened previous in the relationship, but it simply wasn't reported. And it's incumbent upon us in those kind of situations where we obviously must protect the victim. So we would work together with the doctor, with Community Care Access Center to if possible, leave the men in the home, the couple together. A lot of times that's not possible because we can't be there 24/7, and we have a responsibility to protect the victim. So a lot of times what it means is either the husband goes into some sort of care facility or they both go.